Welcome back to Psychedelics Today with your hosts Kyle Buller and Joe Moore. Today on the show, we are honored to have Dr. Kile Ortigo. Dr. Ortigo is a clinical psychologist and the founder of the Center for Existential Exploration, which supports people exploring profound questions about identity, meaning, life transitions, and psycho-spiritual development. He also serves on the advisory board of Psychedelic Support, an online training and clinician directory for legal psychedelic-informed care. And you can check them out at psychedelic.support. Really great resource if you're looking for an integration therapist or somebody or a clinician therapist that's psychedelically literate. And he also is on the board of Project New Day, a nonprofit organization providing harm reduction resources for people using psychedelics in their addiction recovery process. And for the past several years, Dr. Ortigo worked at the National Center for PTSD, where he collaborated on technology development and implementation projects ranging from apps like Mindfulness Coach to online programs like WebStare. And Dr. Ortigo also earned his Ph.D. from Emory University and was certified as a psychedelic therapist or trained as a psychedelic therapist at CIIS and mentored under Bill Richards. And he's also the author of a book called Beyond the Narrow Life, a guide for psychedelic integration and existential exploration. And so this is the book that we actually get into today and kind of go over his framework for integration. I thought he did a really great job with the book. I was really impressed, but here's a little snippet from the publisher's page. The book introduces the reader to significant themes elicited by psychospiritual and the therapeutic use of psychedelics, which includes the process of psychedelic integration. These themes integrate several frameworks from third wave cognitive behavioral therapy to Jungian depth psychology, existentialism to scientific understandings of the cosmos and mindfulness, and compassion-focused traditions to popular and secular culture. Yeah, so really impressed by Dr. Ortigo's work and really enjoyed the book. It is being published by Synergetic Press, so you could definitely check that out over at synergeticpress.com. And I think it might be out. Okay, no, it's on pre-order still. So that will ship out on June 29th. So again, you can check that out at synergeticpress.com and definitely check out his book. And you can find Dr. Ortigo's work also, if you want to check him out online, at existentialexploration.org. Yeah, Joe and I really enjoyed this conversation. Really great to get to know Kyle, and always fun to chat about integration. I think it's a ever-evolving topic that the community is exploring, and always fun to riff on the topic. I think that's it for the intro for Dr. Ortigo. And let's see what's coming up here. So we have our new group of Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists coming up on May 20th. So check that out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We have two groups, one at 2 p.m. Eastern and the other one at 7 p.m. Eastern. And we'd love to have you. It's a nice hybrid course that you get access to a ton of pre-recorded material and wonderful master class interviews. And then you'll meet online with us for an hour and a half for 8 weeks for a classroom to really dig into the topics a little bit more in depth and have that nice classroom experience. We'd love to have you. And it's also CE approved. And there's more information about the CE credits at psychedeliceducationcenter.com, and go follow the link over to Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. And definitely check out any of our other free classes or other online classes at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We have a really great class up there called Imagination as Revelation by Johanna Hilla, exploring psychedelics and Jung. We also have a course on the shadow side of psychedelics that I co-did with Dr. Ido Cohen. So check that out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And if you want to support the show, you could check us out at patreon.com for a small monthly donation. Help keep the lights on over here at patreon.com/psychedelics today. And if you can't support us that way, no problem. The best way to support us is by subscribing to our podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a review on Apple, on iTunes. That helps us out a whole bunch. And, one of the best ways is just to share our content, let others know that you're listening, and let others know what we're up to. So take some time, share some of our content. We really appreciate it. So that's it for the intro. I hope everybody is having a wonderful week. Thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you on the other side.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, Kyle and I are interviewing a new guest, Kile Ortigo, Ph.D., clinical psychologist. I might start calling you an integration specialist, Kyle. But let's kind of chat about your background. Like, how did you kind of come to this psychedelic psychology angle that you've landed on?
Yeah, it's a circuitous answer, but I
Yeah.
will say at first, I first learned about psychedelics in kind of an academic, pseudo unspoken way when I was an undergrad and I was doing psychology, but I was also doing film studies work. And it was in my film studies work that was based on like a mythological interpretation of film that I came across movies and references to psychedelics. The movie I'm thinking of is the film Altered States. I don't know if you all have seen that. That was back in 1980, I believe, which is
The
all about,
quintessential float tank film, I
yes,
think. Yeah.
float tank plus psychedelics plus cosmic visions and lots of weirdness. So that was some of my early education in psychedelics. But I went straight into clinical psychology. And oh, that was also my reference or introduction to Jung, Carl Jung, and Joseph Campbell, which have
Mm.
always been important to me since then. Then I did work in clinical psychology and graduate program on personality and trauma, and psychedelics were not spoken about at any point. I did work in addiction too, but we really didn't see anyone come in doing psychedelics or presenting that as a problem. So it wasn't until I was out here in the Bay Area that one of my good friends, a UCSF professor at the time, was doing research in MDMA psychotherapy. He was part of the phase 3 trials and also doing psilocybin for uh, anxiety and long-term AIDS survivors work. And so
Mm.
that's how psychedelics came back into my world professionally.
Mm. That's really interesting. Cool. So you had that strong interest, and you were able to, dig into some somewhat academic texts after seeing Altered States to like get a kind of a lay of the land. Is that how that flew for you?
Yeah, yeah. In Altered States, it was just like in film world is so fun and fascinating. These humanities texts are just labyrinths of
Yeah.
references here and there. So it wasn't like a paper focus on Altered States, but I remember seeing that reference and it stood out in my mind, and I found the film, and then I became hooked. And these kind of weird B movie films and stuff.
Who were some of the early influences for you at that point in time?
Yeah, in terms of
Like writers,
theory,
thinkers.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was my introduction to Carl Jung, who
Hmm.
has always been important to me ever since. And that I was like 19, I think,
Yeah.
when I first read him and Joseph Campbell, and that continued. I didn't hear about Jung at all in the psychology departments except for like a paragraph in an intro text, in
Yeah.
psychology, and that was still the case in my graduate school program. But my grad program talked about all sorts of theories. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, can be really popular in most PhD clinical science programs, and Emory was like that. But we had a great diversity of professors. We had people who were strict behaviorists, we had people who were strict cognitive, and then we had people who were all sorts of flavors of interpersonal psychotherapy. My advisor was an object relations psychodynamic researcher. And through one of his former postdocs is how I got immediately tied into the trauma world and trauma work and the VA, the government, working with veterans. So it was a diverse program, especially for clinical science, but Jung still wasn't spoken about, but I would always bring him up kind of in a rebellious way. Like, we
Right.
got to talk about Jung.
That's
The
interesting.
depth traditions have to be inserted.
Yes, exactly.
So Emory was not really depth oriented. So you said you were at Emory. Did you ever bump into Gary Latterman?
No, no, I didn't.
Really interesting professor there, focuses on sex, drugs, music, and death.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
What a specialty, right?
Yeah. That's fantastic. Do you know what department he was in?
I don't. I think he's religious studies.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to have him on. I think I record with him on the 5th of January. So I'm really excited about that.
I'll have to listen
But it
to that.
seems like there's something going on at Emory. We keep bumping into Emory folks. I
Mhm.
think we're working with somebody to develop a course from Emory. Yeah. Did it feel distinctly psychedelic there? I imagine not.
No.
Um,
Uh, but there is that School of Divinity. They have a MDiv program,
mm,
and they have one of the most interesting chapels that I've ever come across. And I would go there to study sometimes. And the chapel's interesting from an architecture standpoint because
mm,
it looks like it's made out of wood and a
yeah.
lot of interesting use of negative space. But it's made out of concrete, and they press wood against the concrete to create that texture. And it's kind of a postmodern chapel, really. So I would go there for something completely different than my psychology program, but that's where I do
Uh,
my work and readings.
that's very cool. And did you do your PhD at Emory?
Yes, yeah, my master's and
Great.
PhD,
Great. Where was your undergrad?
University of Arkansas.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. For whatever reason, I forget how close like the Southeast states are to each other.
Mhm.
It's really cool. We've got a good friend in Fayetteville. It seems like Fayetteville might be an interesting new hotspot coming up.
That's very encouraging for me to hear. I love Fayetteville.
Keep track. We'll keep you posted for sure. I've not been to Arkansas. I've got fish tickets for Arkansas next summer, but who knows if that's going to work out. Yeah. Anyway, so you did your PhD there, and did you immediately jump into the VA?
Yes. Well, not immediately. By the end, I was already in the VA. So I started working for the Grady Trauma Project. Grady Memorial Hospitals, the national public or the state public hospital there,
Mm.
serves a lot of low SES populations, primarily African American, a lot of homeless people. So the Grady Trauma Project was just bringing trauma into the conversation about how to care for people in this hospital system, which
Mm.
seems mind boggling that trauma was not already integrated into the care of all kind going in a hospital like that. It really is surprising. But this was that project probably started back in 2005 officially. So,
Mm.
people just weren't talking about trauma and PTSD that much
No.
until after 9/11, really. And still it's been focused mostly with veteran military populations, but trauma is everywhere, and especially
Oh yeah.
in these very vulnerable populations. So
Mm.
that was diving right in to that world. But one of my co-advisors was also the head of the trauma program at Atlanta VA, so I always knew I was going to eventually work with veterans as well in that setting, and that's what I did in my final year. And that's why I came out to California to work at the VA Palo Alto, San Francisco VA, Stanford, and
Mm.
UCSF, and see how they do things out here.
Were you when you were treating folks or working on people's treatment plans and whatnot? Were you at a certain point? Did you start getting frustrated with how the VA was treating people with trauma, or like how did you kind of think about that? Just limited
Yeah,
resources, like limited scope, or yeah? Go ahead.
really good question, because I think this is surprising to people. But given my trajectory that I just said, I was working in this public hospital. It had a lot of gaps in care, and I would be seeing people who were homeless or marginally housed. They were getting psychiatry, they were getting med management, but no psychotherapy.
Mm.
And I think they've increased their programs. They have a good inpatient trauma program out at Grady Hospital, but there wasn't a whole lot outpatient at that time. And when I was working with someone doing trauma work, it's always important to recognize what else is going on besides PTSD symptoms, if that is indeed their diagnosis. And it was so disconnected from the other specialty programs if they existed at all. So when I got into the VA, I was amazed by having a team of providers working with people, having resources that I just did not have access to for my clients when I was working in the hospital system. And even at Emory, when I was working in the psychology center. So the VA, there are some challenges because it's a big system and like
Oh yeah.
Kaiser has challenges, right? But there, in my experience, and most VAs, most mental health programs I've worked at, that there are a lot of really well trained mental health providers who do really care. I think it would be very hard to work in a system like the VA and not care. Um, but there are challenges because of the bureaucracy.
You've got to get worn down after a little bit too, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one of the downsides of working in any sort of big, large, complex system is that the metrics that you're being evaluated on are how many patients you're seeing a day or a week.
Right.
Not necessarily are they improving. And even if it
Oof.
were just about are they improving, like how do you measure improvement? What standards? What about people who aren't improving? What do we do with them? And they still need care. So the VA is confronting these things. I worked at the National Center for PTSD, which is our research think tank that's tied to the Department of Veterans Affairs. And we worked a lot on measurement based care initiatives, using technology, really having a public health mindset about how to get more care, more quality care to more people. But these things are complex. No amount of like sound bites really capture all the multiple things that are at play. Um, but in general, I think there are some really good providers, people who care. I loved working with veterans.
Yeah. We just did a really great interview with Craig Heacock, who's a psychiatrist in Fort Collins, Colorado. I really suggest folks check that one out. It's just, talking about like the different classifications of psychiatrists generally. And it's just like such a burnout scenario if you don't have like great resources.
Mhm.
So you could be the most amazing psychiatrist and just after a couple of years just get so burnt out that it's like, how how do you how do you get reinvigorated? Like I think burnout in mental health care is pretty
It's
significant.
huge.
I guess in
Yeah.
healthcare generally, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know a number of nurses who have quit their jobs since COVID
Oh gosh,
hit.
nurses, they have it the worst, I feel. Like
It's not
really.
pretty.
No, no, they save the system. They're the real heroes. But yeah, I think doctors, psychiatrists, a lot of my friends and colleagues here are psychiatrists. I think if they only do med management, you can just feel like that's what people are coming in to see you for. They want their meds. They're not really engaging in a deeper personal way. And not all psychiatrists are trained in psychotherapy either. That
Right.
has
It's important to
changed a
know.
lot. Hmm. Yeah. But trauma, because it's become such a hot button topic as it should be, and PTSD as well in the last 20 years, especially, uh, it's easy to forget that therapists, psychologists, providers, like people don't do full time trauma work. That wasn't a thing until relatively recently in history. And we're there's still some debate like is that a good idea for someone to do trauma day in day out with multiple clients? And you guys know about secondary trauma and
Oh, yeah.
burnout. They're different but they're related. And like how do you cope and deal with all these things?
It's a real thing. Took me about like a year to shake off some stuff that I went through when I was working in residential. So yeah, it is a real thing.
Wow. Yeah. I'll tell you a story about that. I learned that it was a real thing after my first day being trained in exposure therapy when one of the providers this was going to be a three-phase research study, but one of the trainers, they just didn't prepare us for what it's like to hear someone talk about their childhood sexual trauma in as much detail as possible, as if it was happening
Mm.
there and then. And the entire project fell apart. The next week,
Wow.
I learned that there would be no more meetings, that all the clinicians had quit. I was like 22 at the time. I had a violent nightmare that night. Made no connection whatsoever to what I heard, which deeply disturbed me, but I thought it was contained, But that was my wake up call. It's like, oh, yeah, got to pay attention to this and also pay attention to how we train people in trauma, you know,
Totally.
really prepare them for that work.
Yeah. Makes me wonder just in terms of like the psychedelic world. I always kind of come back to this quote. One of my teachers has always kind of said, Michael Harner, like shamanism's like a part-time job. And I wonder like what we'll be seeing for like the future of psychedelic psychotherapy. People that want to get involved, like thinking of it as a full-time job, like how many sessions could people actually like contain? Because that's a lot of work, right? Sitting with somebody
Yes,
for that many hours, like how many clients could you actually see in a week? And just thinking about like your own self-care practices to shake some of that trauma off that you're working through. I mean, it's a lot, right?
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I did a group psilocybin retreat. I was one of the guest co-facilitators at Synthesis in Amsterdam back in early February, and it was beautiful, intense but beautiful work over 3 days. And I spoke with the people who were doing that work full time, and they were just exhausted. And you have to go in and out of these really intense, and it's group too, right? It's uh,
That's no
even more
joke. It's a big
intense.
difference.
Everything. Yeah, yeah. Everything gets amplified in groups without psychedelics being on board. So,
Like, I
um,
don't think I could do holotropic breath work in a group even once a week as a
yeah,
facilitator. Like, that would be way too much.
yep. Yeah. After that experience, I thought if this ever becomes legalized and available in the States, it's still, I think, at most I would limit it to once a month. But even
Mm.
that may be a little intense. I love doing the integration work and the meaning making side of things for people who've already had an experience, because that's a real in depth process. But that I could sustain.
Hmm.
Doing these retreats like every week or day is intense. And I think some people, one of the other co-facilitators who was volunteering, she had only had one psychedelic experience before and was I think a little surprised how was some stressful things that came up for some
Mm,
clients, and how it wasn't it's not always guaranteed to be like a beautiful stress-free experience, which is it's obvious, I think, to those of us who support people with integration and really explore this world. But that's an important developmental process too, is recognizing that there are different types of experiences that can be very deeply meaningful and important, but knowing how to sometimes step back and let a person have their experience, or when to intervene. Like, these are
yeah.
very nuanced, challenging things to navigate.
Yeah,
Mm.
completely agree. I mean, this is something Joe and I talk about pretty often in our course, just about interventions and when to intervene. And I think something that I've really come back to, especially with our work with breath work, is just having our own experiences there and kind of knowing, maybe going through part of your own process. And like, there's definitely been times where I've been so stuck in something, and from I'm guessing like an observer perspective, it probably looked really painful or difficult, but like kind of what's going on inside is much different. I'm like, oh, like I need to go through this, and to have somebody just interrupt the process, it's happened to me in the past, and it's really kind of like broke the process a little bit. And I think having a lot of those experiences under my belt at times feels, just gives me some insight, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, no matter what type of psychotherapy someone is trained in, or support or coaching, I think that's always an important part of the process, is knowing when to let someone just be, and having that experience of being interrupted yourself can help. But I think a lot of people get into the field because they want to actively help others, and that's part of what needs to be explored and unlearned sometimes. But that's very true in psychedelic psychotherapy or psychedelic retreats, and is being able to figure that out.
Can you go
But
into
there
that a
is,
little bit more? Like, what do you mean
yeah,
by unlearn that helping
hmm
aspect?
yeah. So I'm thinking in particular for, we'll say, trained therapists who learn intervention models that are very active, which I really appreciate active intervention models, especially third wave behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. Interpersonal psychotherapy is an active process oriented therapy where there's a way that the therapist shows up actively in sessions, and those are good. They have their place, but they can't be the only mode that you're familiar with is actively intervening or even talking, like using words, right? So some of that I think is what needs to be unlearned or expanded. And when you go into process oriented dynamic work or psychedelic psychotherapy or spiritual circles, and it's not that that stuff just needs to be abandoned completely, but we need to loosen our attachments on active intervention sometimes and realize that just bearing witness, being present in a mental way, can be what's most healing to allow people to have their experience, whatever it is.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, the non-directive approach sometimes I feel like is really hard to kind of wrap your mind around because I think as humans we want to feel active in helping. And yeah, just that idea of, just being there with somebody and thinking like, am I helping this person? And trying to unlearn that and be like, maybe, right? Like just being a witness and observer in somebody's process. When have you ever in your life just been witnessed by somebody else when maybe you didn't want them to intervene or act on something? I think yeah, it's a really big topic and important, I think, as well.
Yeah. I think what helped me in that going into this world was doing hospice work,
Mm,
and working in that setting is definitely a place where you need to be able to put aside all of your intellectual intervention mindset, not forget it. It does play a role sometimes, but to be able to just patiently listen and be present. And it's an act of non avoidance too, when you're thinking about end of life care or working with trauma, right? That you're not going to be scared away. You're not going to have a great deal of revulsion based on what's coming up for a person physically or psychologically. I think of the role. I was meeting with someone this week who is dealing with a great deal of shame. And this is not in the context of psychedelic psychotherapy, but this client has had psychedelic experiences. But just how powerful shame is and how the impulse is to hide and to avoid being seen. So sometimes the intervention, the actual care is about fully being present to whatever uh, is happening. And that's not coming in forcing someone to disclose or forcing someone to open up about what's going on for them, but just to be available so that they know that you're not going to be judging, that you're there if needed to.
right. Yeah, and you even just kind of using that word like forcing somebody to share something. I'm just thinking like how triggering that could be to the nervous system,
Oh
right? And
yeah,
kind of activate either those shutdown states or like that those fight or flight states of like I need to get out of here now. Just kind of being aware of that.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's part of the trust that needs to be developed more often than not for people who are dealing with shame or intense anxiety or trauma. And certainly from an attachment lens, that's important as well.
Before we jump into integration more specifically, I'm wondering if you've thought of how a lot of folks kind of will just come at psychedelic therapy from their point of view. So like we'll see like the ACE model, CBT model. We'll see like a number of like psychotherapy techniques used specifically in discussing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. Do you have any like kind of observations or anything you've learned around that? Like I think we've been kind of dancing around it a little bit, but just wanted to see if you had any thoughts there.
Yeah, yeah, that's a big bucket, but a really important one.
It's
I
okay to
love
not go too deep,
it.
as
No,
far as you want.
now I'm gonna go as deep as I can. I love that. And I think that's going to evolve. That needs to be a part of the conversation. I think the non-directive approach, which has been part of the more dominant model with research up to this point, it's changed in the last couple of years, it is a good one. There's lots about that. I think that's part of the counterbalancing for this very heavy active intervention mindset. And at the same time, if you like observe the Mithoffers and what they do with a lot of clients, they are active. It's not that they're just sitting back and watching. And this is true with a lot of the psilocybin studies as well. But it's not a default of going in there to do XYZ or to ask these specific questions or to make sure that you have these interventions that you use for this client. It's a very intuitive, mindful process. So that's nice and abstract to say right now. And, and I think for some therapists that may be enough, but it's not when you're thinking about training, when you're thinking about all the various scenarios that can come up for people in and outside of a psychedelic experience. So having a balance between these different models, you mentioned ACE, like ACT is great. ACT is also very much acceptance commitment therapy is very much focused on a process too. It's not a rigid manualized treatment like some other models can be very manualized and you do this in session one, this in session two. And there are versions of that with ACT. But I think these what's really important is getting into the theory, the idea, the conceptualization, the why, what you think is the problem, which is always collaborative with someone, and what might be some approaches that could help with that. What are your intentions going in if we're staying with the psychedelic therapy world? What are your intentions? How do you frame an intention? What happens in this session, what your expectations are, what's helpful based on what you know in the past about yourself. Do you want to be asked every hour, like how you're doing? Like, how will I know that you need support? Can you communicate that? Like, that's part of the preparation work, but that's an intervention too, right? You're helping people with communication of their needs, letting them know that it's okay, it's safe. So some of this is just the common factors in the psychotherapy research world. We call some of this the common factors approach, the things that are healing no matter what type of technique or therapy you're doing with someone. And we need to explicitly train people in that stuff. We don't always do that in therapy, but that's important. Like, you can't just assume everyone's going to go in being present, having empathy, talking about therapeutic goals, etc. So there's that collaboration. I think that's important. But then when you get into the more complex stuff, it's important in my mind to have a variety of theories, a variety of techniques, just that can rest comfortably in the background in case they're needed. So don't want to privilege them as what's really healing or really important or necessary, but they're there when there are opportunities that come up that they may really help someone. But this is the dance of psychotherapy of any kind, like what you know and what's applied, and it's always in collaboration with the person.
Mm. Hmm. That's great. So, yeah. So before we jump into integration again, so you mentioned intention setting. How do you like to approach that? Like whenever I discuss this, I always kind of have this weird kind of groff slant where like, my body, my unconscious knows what I
Mhm.
really need to work on, or at least has the biggest, energetic charge is the way I phrase it. But I know a lot of people do it differently. Like, how do you talk about that?
Yeah. Uh, I've had some conversations with people recently about intention setting versus expectations
Hmm.
and the differences between these words. And I think they can be often confused for people. So the type of kind of framing that I like is to have some general idea if it exists already. That what you're looking for, why you're coming to these medicines, if someone's going off for an ayahuasca retreat, for example, but also encouraging even at that stage flexibility and an awareness that what you think might be your intention going in, you don't want to hold it too tightly. You don't want it to be a concrete goal that you have set out for yourself. I think that sets people up for not only disappointment, but it can reinforce this active control of the journey, the experience. This is true in therapy too. And this is a central idea in acceptance and commitment therapy. So the ACE model, what that's based on. So I like building in flexibility when thinking about intentions, and to acknowledge, whatever comes up is in some ways probably what needs to come up. I think that's also what you're referring to when thinking about Groff and my experiences with holotropic breath work. But
Right.
I mean, that's an intervention itself, right? If someone's coming in with a very clear idea, like they want to work on this, and that's the whole point of having this intense psychedelic experience. And that may tell us something about how they're approaching their world, their life, their emotions, even.
Mm, hmm. Cool. So let's jump into integration now. So you're in the process of writing a whole book on this. It's going to be with Synergetic Press, and excited for it because you've clearly done a ton of work here and have a lot to share. I lately I've been getting kind of confused about integration.
Hmm.
Like, my my advice, I think, typically is like slow down as much as you can, try to journal some, figure out what works. Like that's the general outline.
Yeah.
Like try a lot of things, but like why are we integrating? What even is integration? Like is it just because we live in an insane society that we're integrating? Like, these are the questions that kind of come up for me. But where do we want to start here? Uh,
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you have a definition that you like to work with?
Yeah. No, I think this is a great place to start. I don't have a definition that I want to start with. I want to start with that ambiguity that you're bringing in.
Mm,
And I think it's a shorthand, right? When we talk about psychedelic integration, even when we talk about preparation, the experience, all these different phases, and that's true too. And the book that I've written is based on like a guided journey. I created a structured journey through these major themes that can come up in psychedelic journeys, but they also can just come up with being in the world, living our human lives. And when I was planning, like the model that came to mind immediately was Joseph Campbell's hero's journey,
mm,
and the three main stages of the hero's journey, which are departure, initiation, and return. And I saw some beautiful parallels with preparation, experience, integration, and a lot of other kind of three act storytelling and things like that. So, what I thought was important to me when doing this work is how to talk about psychedelic integration in a way that isn't just about psychedelics. It's
hmm.
about being a human in this day and age, and all the things that we know from various schools of thought, but just even from basic science that we have exposure to and knowledge and some awareness of these days, but it's hard to fit into the narrative of being this super tiny speck of dust in a cosmos that we can't fathom. And this is where I think there's that tension between like having some expectations, having structure, having skills, having a narrative, some linear understanding, and just the full on flexibility, non-linearity, all those parts of the mystical experiences that are so non ordinary to our daily life, where that
Hmm.
tension is one that's really, I think, fun to play with and to explore. And this is where creativity comes in. So to do kind of the absurd thing of having a seemingly linear journey about an experience that its ineffability is very much a part of the definition for a mystical state, to be brought into conversation with something like a book, which is even more absurd because it's full of words, right? So, thinking about these parallels with different schools of thought, but Joseph Campbell's work and comparative mythology being a kind of touchstone as a way to bring these different perspectives into conversation is the approach I'm taking to integration. So, I say psychedelic integration, but the other piece of this is the existential exploration part. Like, what does it mean to be a human? Who am I?
Mm.
As the first and fundamental question that people can start with. And what does it mean to be in this world and to deal with things like death and loss and relationships and all of their complexity and the search for meaning when we're not sure that there's any meaning at all? So, this was kind of the challenge and why I framed it both in terms of integration and exploration. But in many ways, this could be part of preparation work too, like getting a lay of the land of the world and what it could mean to be human living in the cosmos. So, a little meandering response to that, but kind of how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and I just love the focus there on like the existential perspective. I just think about like, most of my experiences and just thinking after I had a near death experience, that was probably the hardest thing to I guess, deal with is some of like the existential questions that came up. And, you kind of pointed it out there, like, what am I doing here? Who am I? And I think that was kind of like the biggest part of trying to integrate an experience. And, I see that you did incorporate a lot of like mythologies, Joseph Campbell, Jung, and like the archetypes in some of your work and in the book that you're putting out. And I wonder like, yeah, how does mythology and archetypes kind of play a role here for you in terms of, integration? It's something that I've been really thinking about recently of, being able to make meaning out of our experiences and kind of looking back at these like archetypes and being able to resonate with it sometimes feels like it gives me meaning versus like I guess that would kind of fall within like the depth realm, right?
Hmm.
Versus kind of taking more of a like a behavioral approach to integration and being like, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and this is kind of part of it. So yeah, just curious about that idea of mythology, meaning making, storytelling, narrative, and archetypes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think when you're talking about an individual, I really bring it down to what is someone coming in with? What is their experience? If it's a psychedelic journey they had, like what happened? Um, and sometimes it's very clear, like there was a shadow figure that showed up in a journey that was very scary for them. So that would point us in a certain direction. A lot of psychedelic journeys don't have any sort of figure, others, or anything like that. And not all archetypes are humanoid form, right? There can be, speaking of the shadow, it could show up like a black hole. It could show up in other symbolic ways. So, what I'll say about mythology and storytelling is that, as far as we can tell, humans, at least since recorded history and probably beyond, we've told stories. That's been part of communication.
Mm.
And there's an entertainment value to that. But most stories, especially the ones that cut across time or are very popular, have also some message, usually multiple messages that they're communicating. And these messages have some applicability to life and how to live life, how to engage with ethical questions or dilemmas or difficult times or experiences. All those existential themes that we already mentioned, like those are part of stories and mythology. There, like Campbell and others have compared a lot of religious sacred texts as also representing mythology. Jung certainly did as well. And so through telling stories, you're doing, I think you all know Jung and spoken with other Jungians on this podcast, but this idea of amplification, you're amplifying some of these personal themes or unconscious material or memes through hearing the stories of others or engaging deeply with art, which really puts out there in some relationship you have with something that's external to you, something that you're feeling inside, but maybe you haven't fully processed or fully understand. So there's a part of mythology that is about that amplification. That's you had this near death experience. Are there other films or stories out there of people who also had near death experiences that may be very different than yours, but may have some overlap? How did they live in the world after that? How did it change their life? It's a it's a relational process. Like you're
Mm,
relating to these other stories of people, and those can be fictional stories or not, and it doesn't really matter. In some ways, fiction actually is better because it's like dream material. It speaks very much in symbols, which in a Jungian sense, right, can get us closer to more of the collective unconscious or transpersonal realms, but it may also be safer in some way than just going explicitly to the content. But it's also pointing to something that transcends the personal experience that is about, we'll just stick with kind of the existential fears, right? They're they deal with what humans in general across time or at least across the globe have to confront and deal with in one way or another. So I mean that's one way I think about it. There these phases of like preparation, experience, integration, like all these theories too that we've mentioned already, approaches to psychotherapy, all of those are myths as well in some sense.
right.
um,
I
they
think James
are.
Hillman talks about that.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, I haven't read much of Hillman, so I've heard some good things. But yeah, the myths are everywhere, and I think when we start to, in common language, we think of myth meaning a lie, and there's a part of that that's true if you're taking a very concrete perspective and idea. If you're reifying these ideas, these phases of therapy, even the hero's journey. Like there are 17 stages of the hero's journey. You got to do all of them, right? Like all of these things are where you're kind of missing the point, which is symbolic in nature. But by engaging with stories, by paying attention to what really speaks to you just in everyday life, like Marvel movies are really popular now. Superheroes have been around for the last 20 years in mainstream consciousness. What is that about? What does that mean? Does that mean to these people? These people from a lot of different walks of life, different even religious and political viewpoints come together to watch the next Avengers film. Like, how is this speaking to something that is appealing? That's not just about entertainment. That's the other piece of myth, and getting at the deeper symbolic meaning of myth that I think is important. That I wanted to bring into uh, this work.
Mm, yeah. This whole idea of meaning making and myth and it's so deep. There's so much there. I think that's why we all love Carl Jung so much.
Hmm.
And Campbell, like it's endless. Like they just keep Jung books keep coming.
They do, yeah. The black
It's
books
almost like
just came out.
Tupac tracks or something. Like he's dead, but they keep coming out.
Somebody's channeling him somewhere, just writing it
Yeah,
down.
thank God. Wouldn't have it any other way. Have you had a chance to touch the black books yet or check those out at all?
Just a little bit. It's so odd with the red book and the black book, just how personal they are. Like these are things that Jung never intended to publish.
Right.
And the black book's being a lot of his journals, and it's just such a peek into his world and his mind. And I think all sorts of writing, it's very vulnerable writing and putting yourself out there in that way. But that's amplified, speaking of, when you're thinking about someone's journals, right, where they're just free flowing, doing free association and active imagination. So it's risky. So there's this sense of kind of guilt looking at it almost, but I don't know. Have you had a chance to look at them?
Only the red book, not the black books yet. We're exploring the idea of a class on the Black Books. We're not sure yet, but I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, definitely would
But
be
yeah, I
interesting.
totally agree with you there, Kyle. Like it is a little awkward knowing that he never really intended for these to get in the hands of the public.
Yeah.
How to approach that? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the public life persona, to use his language too, and one's private self, like these are things that he was very much conscious about, and cause some disconnect and suffering for him at different points in his life. But um, this thing is relevant to all of us in this age of no privacy and social media. It's still relevant.
Right. Like this is going to be a really tough conversation, but like this idea of post privacy
Hmm.
is a real thing. Like even the wealthy and most powerful people in the world are also going to have barely any privacy in 15 years, 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's going to be like a really creeping, scary process over the next bit of time here.
Yeah, and that's why, speaking of mythology, that's why I focused in film work on science fiction in particular, because mythology is being created, I would say, at a very rapid pace these days, and it's being communicated in a much higher scale. And that's primarily through our science fiction, I think, because it's previewing some of these challenges that
Mm,
are here right now, and we knew they were coming, but we haven't been paying attention to them, and we need to. Black
mm.
Mirror is important.
Yeah.
I haven't touched yet. I'm a little scared, but we probably should because it does
Yeah.
discuss a lot of these really important things.
Mhm.
Yeah. Probably why a lot of psychedelic people really love science fiction,
Mhm. Mhm.
from Terrence McKenna on. Yeah. So I guess do you believe might be a tough one? Feel free to just riff on it too. Like I'm not looking for a firm answer. Do you believe that there's a possibility that folks could create like some sort of discrete metric around psychedelic integration,
Hmm.
like a functional measure that would be helpful for psychologists and psychiatrists?
Yeah, good question. I mean, psychologists have created all sorts of measures and tools for things that, in all essence, shouldn't be measurable, but we found ways
Hmm.
to. Um, with caveats, right? Always, like the mystical experiences, like we have scales for that,
Right. Like
multiple
MEQ is such a goofy thing, but it is functional.
now. Yeah, and they're all different types of validity. Like, what is this thing actually measuring, for any measure that we're talking about? So if we created a tool for integration processes in progress, what are we actually measuring? We have to be able to define that. Then we have to come up with items and ways of trying to measure it. Then we have to validate it as actually measuring the thing that we think it's measuring. So it would be an involved process, I think, if it's an actual assessment tool
And I
that
think
has
we would have to
limits.
really define what integration is
Yes.
too,
Yeah.
right?
Which we keep skirting around. Right.
Like, what is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's the thing that Lenny, our breathwork teacher and mentor, kind of keeps raising to us. It's like integration is really only an issue because the world is no longer animated. The world isn't
Mm.
alive the same way it was 2,000-3,000 years ago
Yeah.
for the West, for our culture currently. And that's the thing that really disintegrates us. It's like, oh, everything's alive and there's so much living things around us.
Mhm.
If we can accept that, it's kind of a scary thing. You get hospitalized for believing that in some places.
Mhm. Yeah. Well,
Yeah, what do you
we're
any
dealing with,
go ahead.
I'm thinking of like what it actually means, integration. And,
Mm,
Jung talked about the individuation process, which has always been what's most fascinating to me. And that process, for people who haven't heard about it, I know you two know it, is the lifelong integration of one's self, and layers of conscious and unconscious, into really transcending some of these opposite motivations and parts of self. So it's the process of becoming more psychologically whole, is the shortest way of thinking about it. But that process involves both integration and disintegration, or synthesis and analysis of the different parts of self and then bringing them back together in conversation to create some synergy. So it's a back and forth. It's a dialogue, and I think that's true when we think about integration of psychedelic experiences, but that's true of integration of like a near death experience, of any powerful experience of trauma. How do we make sense of how do we situate this within our life story? And postmodernism has been heavily influential for I would say in mainstream society for at least 30, 40 years. And this is a tension when we're thinking about Jung, when we're thinking about Joseph Campbell's work, when we're thinking about any sort of what's called a meta narrative, like big theory, big idea about capital T truth. And I think part of where we're at now is realizing how much of a loss that is to lose our myth, to lose our
Mm.
belief in some transcendent whole of some truth. Certainly about us as individuals that can show up in life across generations and time. But now, as Western culture, dealing with issues of diversity, which are very important, but how to see both similarity and difference, not have them be opposed to one another, but to bring all these things into a collaborative kind of conversation is how I would think about integration, kind of personally, psychologically speaking, and maybe what we're grappling with now as a culture and society in a global community.
Yeah. When you work with clients, like, is there a way that you approach integration if you do any of that work?
Hmm. Yeah, you know, first, I think is hearing for someone what the experience was, because I don't do preparation work per se because that's a ethical gray area. I do integration work for people who've had either legal experiences out of state or already had experience and need help making meaning out of it. And so it is about hearing what the journey was like, or multiple journeys, often for some people, what themes are coming up. But it is also hearing the full context of this person's life and their story and what they grappled with. And it's kind of a stereotype as a psychodynamically oriented person to get childhood history and all that, but it's important. And that's relevant too, to hear what themes have come up, what their stories have been about who they are as an individual, um, how who their parents were, what they were told explicitly, what they were taught. So part of integration uh, starts from the very beginning, from our first separation from our loved ones, our caregivers, and the creation of this attachment system, what we learn about ourselves and other people in relationship. So all of that's still important when it comes to psychedelic integration. What I've shifted to in recent years is allowing some of that to just come up organically. So not be getting like the full story narrative of someone's early experiences, but just if it's important, it will come up. Right? It will show up in some ways, and then it's usually most therapeutically beneficial to go there when it shows up, when there are hints of it, or where intuitively in a session someone talks about this like powerful mother goddess figure that showed up in a journey or a dream that really surprised them and they didn't know what to make for it. That's a great opportunity to really explore the mother archetype or their early developmental history. So I think one way that I approach it sometimes is just to see what symbols showed up for the person, what is really most striking or powerful, most confusing. I like going to things that are confusing because I think that's a sign that okay, there's something here that hasn't been fully processed or we can't fully intellectualize or make sense of. So it's really organic and intuitive. I think person to person. I don't have a linear approach to it besides getting the story of the person's experience. If they had intentions going in, knowing what those were, seeing how they're already integrating it in some way, just telling the story alone is part of integration, right? Kind of solidifying that in one's memory. But journaling, in terms of integration practices, and these are the classic ones. I like to go for things that are powerful interventions, no matter the issue or problem, with the type of deep work that I like to do, and that's journaling and compassion focus, meditations if someone's willing and open to doing meditation. But I have that toolbox I mentioned in the back of my mind, depending on a person's goals and what their intentions are for the integration process itself. Sometimes that's very clear, and sometimes it's not.
Right. Yeah, it does feel very individualistic at times, and depending where a person's at, what they're bringing to the table, it doesn't feel like there's such a specific formula. I don't know, at least when I think about integration and when people ask me about it, I never really think that it's like, this, and you integrate your experience. It's really dynamic and individual at times.
Yeah, and I think that what is nice to think about too is this idea of community, of interaction, speaking with others who've had experiences. If we're talking about psychedelics in particular, but that dialogue, that conversation, it doesn't mean that people have to have the same experiences for these experiences, whatever they may be, to open up doorways to conversations that are a lot more deeper and authentic than a person would have otherwise, right?
Right.
And how
And
powerful that is.
yeah, and kind of coming back to, say, rites of passages and maybe thinking about like the hero's journey and just thinking about integration, say from, maybe like a shamanic tradition or some sort of tradition, right? It's like you have this experience and then you come back. And I think, like, what is the mythology of that culture? And how does like an experience fit into that? And I wonder, I mean, I guess this is kind of like what Joe is saying. It's like maybe we don't have
Mm.
that and it's kind of dead, and we're all coming back trying to take maybe some of this information and fit it into a culture that, I don't know, what is our cultural mythology here, how do we make sense of that versus like some of these other maybe traditional cultures that had that, right? And it was easier to come back into that and be like, oh, this is my experience, and having some sort of framework to really make sense of it.
Yeah, yeah. Now, one of my friends does a psychedelic chaplaincy in Europe, in
Cool.
the Netherlands. Yeah, and that's just, I mean, that's a cool phrase or job description to begin with.
Yeah.
But I think what I learned from some of the chaplains I worked with, interfaith chaplains I worked with in hospice, was how to navigate these different worldviews, right? And part of that postmodern condition has been a fracturing, a criticism of these big meta narratives, these overarching traditions, whether it be religious or related to just kind of an understanding of what reality is. Like all meta narratives, none were safe in that critique. But I think the benefit, and that was necessary. I'm of the mindset that that was important to be able to have a critique, because there are a lot of stories, narratives, and experiences that have been left out because of that. But in this kind of counter move of synthesis, like how do we have an awareness of these different worldviews and mindsets of Western culture and their various subcultures in the West? But to use this oversimplified language of the Western culture, American culture, the South versus California, different indigenous communities, like the word shamanism, there are many different other words and for different tribes and indigenous communities, and those practices are different too. How do we have an awareness of all this diversity while also having a strong enough yet still flexible framework and idea about how to approach integration, or how to approach being fully human, whatever that is, if such a thing exists, in this day and age with all these complex issues that we're working with? And that was a big impetus for writing this book, is how do you bring all these deeply diverse psychedelic experiences into any framework, whatever it be, however we outline it, however complex, into a journey. And that's why I think these existential fears, concerns, and also hopes provided that framework. Mythology provided that framework, but it's holding this narrative of the hero's journey, knowing that, and also being able to let it go too, to see how it may not fit for someone.
Mm,
How mythology has always been a lot more diverse and flexible and alive than we often think about it, because we get some of the stories. But they're like Gilgamesh, one of our ancient myths that we've had. There are many versions of Gilgamesh and different endings to that story. And I think what's beautiful now is if we use this metaphor of film being like a cultural dream or living mythology, then this idea of like the Marvel universe of DC versus Marvel, all these science fiction films, like all these different versions, like it's not just a cynical, we're making remakes to get more money, but there have always been multiple stories that need to be told, including counter stories to our dominant narratives, our hero's journey. And that's why a film like Joker from last year was so incredibly important.
mm.
We needed to hear the story of the shadow and why we need to pay attention to the shadow, and not from a place of judgment or antagonism, but of compassion.
We never got a chance to debrief on that movie, Kyle. I don't think.
No, I don't think so. It
That
was
was
really
something
intense.
else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I'm sure you've heard it all over the place, Kyle, but like oh look, billionaire playboys are the bad guys. Like, who would have thought? Not always the case, right? But sometimes. Like Bruce Wayne and the family is kind of a jerk. Like, yeah, of course somebody's gonna play out their whole thing to make them feel like a hero, right? Like people try their best, generally speaking, even if they're doing horrendous things.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's based on their experiences, what they know and don't know, what they think is
Hmm.
possible. And I think Joker, we were talking about Grady Hospital earlier in the trauma project, and these people that kind of get lost in systems like that. That was part of that film as well. He had a social worker. She wasn't particularly engaged or hopeful or like really.
Right. Like super under resourced, I think is the best way to put it. Like
Mhm.
she didn't have the capacity to really help,
Nope.
even
Right.
though it was her job.
Right. And I'm sure at some point she, as a character, entered the field wanting to help people. I
Right.
don't know anyone in social work, especially going to that
Yeah.
field without intention to help.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. How could you even get there without wanting to help?
Right. But,
Mm.
and this brings us full circle to that burnout idea too, and secondary trauma and all this complexity.
So um I guess we're coming up a little bit on an hour, but I'm curious if you want to like say anything more about your book.
Sure. Yeah. So what I'm doing in the book is I have 9 core themes that I've situated in a narrative structure. It's a guided journey where I use like I, we, you language and voice to make it more conversational, introducing a lot of important, what I see as important themes or concerns. Some of it includes like models. I definitely talk about Jung a lot in the later half of the book, especially
Great.
talk about the individuation process, which is kind of the background to some of these themes. But I guide people through 3 what I call main arcs of the journey. And the first is expanding awareness, and the 3 parts of that arc are cosmic awareness, being introduced to just the vastness, awe-inspiring scales of time and space from a purely scientific standpoint. No, no new age spirituality. I do mention some things like quantum theory, but I don't go into the interpretation, the full implications, but just kind of introducing people to that theme as a place to start to really shake up our mindset of what we think is the nature of reality in the world, even if we go just from a purely scientific standpoint. To the next being self awareness, and then finally experiential awareness. And then the second arc is confronting the trials of initiation, which is where I go into some common existential fears and concerns, and starting with death and loss and impermanence, then moving into loneliness and social relationships, and finally meaning and meaninglessness, which integrates the theme of responsibility as well. And then the final arc is integrating insights and integrating the self, capital S self, from Jung's language of the organizing principle of the psyche, conscious and unconscious. And the first theme there is going beyond ego and identity, and creating more flexibility. The second is confronting the shadow, which of course it was with us all along, and moving into compassion. And then finally, about exploring symbols and creativity. And that's where I introduce this idea of a new hero, what I would call the meta hero, as a way of kind of transcending our traditional kind of worldviews with our postmodern complexity. So that's the book, and each of those has activities that people can choose from that I've created to kind of explore that theme, personalize it, journal prompts. Each chapter has a meditation, and there's a journey report for people, and that's related to the theme of that chapter.
Yeah, really awesome, really in depth. And can you just give the listeners the name of the book, the title? I don't think we mentioned it yet.
Oh yeah, Beyond the Narrow Life: A Guide for Psychedelic Integration and Existential Exploration, and it comes out June 29th, 2021.
Sweet. And that's through Synergetic Press, right?
Yep, Synergetic Prep.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, I'd definitely like to stay in touch and hear more from you. So please do keep us posted. And
Yeah.
do you have a website you want to direct folks towards at all?
Sure. My personal website is existentialexploration.org, and I'm also
Beautiful.
on the board of Psychedelic Support and Project New Day. So those are some other resources I can share.
Awesome.
All right. Well, Kyle, I really appreciate you coming on, and I hope we get the opportunity to do it again.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks, guys, for making this such a smooth and engaging conversation.
Happy to.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. Kile Ortigo. If you want to check out more of Kyle's work, you can check out his website, existentialexploration.org. And again, he will be publishing the book out of Synergetic Press, so you can check that out at synergeticpress.com. And again, the book title is Beyond the Narrow Life: A Guide for Psychedelic Integration and Existential Exploration. And just want to thank Dr. Ortigo again for coming on. It was a really great conversation. Really enjoyed it. I'm just really stoked about his work in general. Again, I really appreciated his book, and it was really great to go through some of the material in there. And glad he's putting the work out to help advance this kind of field of psychedelic integration. And so thank you. Again, if you want to support the show, be sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a review if you're feeling called to it. We greatly appreciate that. And check us out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. Sign up for a free class or check out any of our other classes up there. That helps to support us, what we're doing over here. And I think that's about it. So signing off, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful week, a couple days ahead of you. And we will catch you on the next episode of Psychedelics Today.